Hello, good friends. I'd like to share with you a message that came from a fellow named Jose Gonzalez. Here's what he wrote. Hello, Dr. Tuggy. I greatly admire your appreciation for our Nahuatl language. I wish people could connect to their roots by means of things as simple and beautiful as a poem. I would like to know if you could help me with the pronunciation of this poem by the poet king. And then he gives the poem. Well, I like to do that, so that's what this video is about. A good many of you are probably going to be asking, who's the poet king? Well, he's referring to a man named Nezahualcoyotl, who lived in the city of Texcoco and became king of that city. Texcoco is right near a big lake that used to fill the Valley of Mexico, and the lake was in fact called Lake Texcoco after that town. In an island in the middle of that lake was where the city of Tenochtitlan was, and that's where the Mexica, or the Aztecs, lived. And on the shore near them was a town called Tlacopan. It's known as Tacuba nowadays. And it so happened that the kings of Tlacopan and Tenochtitlan and Texcoco, the one of Texcoco being Nezahualcoyotl, entered into an alliance to fight against the Tepanecos, who were their enemies in the town of Azcapotzalco. They fought against the Tepanecos and came out victorious. Nezahualcoyotl was one of the heroes of that war. And then he settled in as king of Texcoco, but they remained in a triple alliance, and that brought stability and peace to the Mexico Valley and much of the middle of Mexico for almost 100 years. By the dates on our calendar, Nezahualcoyotl was born in 1402, and he took up the kingship of Texcoco in 1431 and was king until 1472 when he passed away. His reign is a golden age for Texcoco generally and for the whole center of Mexico. It was a time when the sciences and the arts, poetry and music flourished. He was a good king who made good laws and was renowned as a wise man. And he's very highly looked up to and thought of as one of the great heroes of pre-Hispanic Mexico. One of the things that not very many people know about Nezahualcoyotl is that he was bilingual. He spoke not only Nahuatl but Otomi. Otomi is generally spoken to the north of the area where Nahuatl was spoken, and Otomi speakers were looked down on by the Nahuatl speakers. In fact, the word Otomi is often translatable as slave in many of the documents from that era. But Nezahualcoyotl was bilingual, and in fact he wrote poetry in Otomi as well as in Nahuatl. Linguistically, Otomi is about as closely related to Nahuatl as Chinese is related to Spanish. I mean, they have nothing in common, other than their geographical proximity and then some overlap of cultural matters that naturally comes with being close neighbors. The name Nezahualcoyotl comes from two stems in Nahuatl. The second one is coyotl, which refers to a wild dog. It was borrowed into Spanish as coyote and made it into English as coyote. So coyote is a Nahuatl word, coyotl. And the first stem is the stem sawa or saba, which means to be fasting or to be without food. So Nezahual means in a state of fasting or in a state of not having eaten. Sometimes the name Nezahualcoyotl is translated as hungry coyote, but it might well be a coyote that's fasting for some personal reason. A mark of the respect in which Nezahualcoyotl is held in contemporary Mexican culture is the fact that his face appears on the 100 peso bill. Not only that, but written there in letters too small for me to make out even with a magnifying glass is the poem that we're going to be examining. A good many of his Nahuatl poems have survived. Apparently the Otomi ones have not. But the poem that friend Jose Gonzalez had asked us to read is probably the most famous one. I will try to read it to you, but I need to do a little bit of explanation first. I need to make a personal clarification and an orthographic or phonological clarification and a couple of cultural clarifications. The personal clarification is that I don't speak 15th century Nahuatl, and I don't even speak Nahuatl of the Central Valley of Mexico. I've learned two other modern variants. So whatever I tell you is going to be an approximation, best I can do. The phonological clarification is this, There is in Nahuatl a thing called a saltillo, and the people that first started writing Nahuatl with the Latin alphabet were by and large people that learned Nahuatl as adults, and they were using the Latin alphabet that they were used to, which does not have a good way to write a saltillo. The saltillo takes two forms. In classical Nahuatl and some modern variants, it's a glottal stop. That means that you stop the air in your throat. In the variants that I learned, it's an H-like sound. You could call it a glottal fricative, or you could call it a voiceless vowel, but here's the difference. If I'm going to pronounce a bunch of glottal stops with I in between them, it's going to come out ah, 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 ah. And if I pronounce a glottal fricative with ah between them, it will be ha, 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 ha. So that's the difference between the two. The classical Nahuatl of the Valley of Mexico used the glottal stop, so I'll be using that when I read the poem to you. The other thing that the Latin orthography didn't mark very well was vowel length, which is not as big a deal as the glottal stop. People can still understand you if you use the wrong length of vowels most of the time. But that also is a thing that was undermarked in the classical orthography. As far as the cultural clarifications, there are two. One of them has to do with the Centzontli, or Sinsonte, or there are different ways that the name is pronounced. Basically, it's a mockingbird, the same species as we call the northern mockingbird here in the United States. And it's called a mockingbird because it can imitate or mimic lots of different things. It can mimic other birds' calls, it can mimic a human voice, it can mimic a cat's meow. The name the scientists give to it is mimus polyglottos, which means the mime or imitator which is multilingual, which is a polyglot. So the idea is that it can speak lots of different languages. In Nahuatl, they call it Sinsonte because of the counting system in Nahuatl. Nahuatl is one of the languages that's got a base 20 rather than a base 10 counting system. If you think about it, it's not too surprising that almost all the base 20 languages in the world are in the tropics. The reason is that if you don't have to wear boots on your feet because you're cold, it's more likely that you'll learn to count using 10 fingers and 10 toes, and so get up to 20. So in Nahuatl, they have the numbers up to 20, and 20, the word for that is one count. So you've got a full count when you've gotten to 20. Then you count by 20s until you get to 20 20s, at which point you have a Centzontli. And a Centzontli means something like a bundle. Centzontli or Centzontli means one bundle, and that means 400. So the mockingbird is called a 400 in Nahuatl, or a 400 bird, and that's because it has so many different voices, 400 of them. 400 in Nahuatl winds up being kind of like 1,000 in English, that you would just say, okay, 1,000 voices means a whole lot of them, we can't even count how many. The other thing that needs some explanation is what's called a Chalchihuite. A Chalchihuite was a precious stone. It's not clear exactly what stone, and it probably was different kinds of stone in different times. Sometimes it's used to mean a turquoise, apparently, but most people think of it as jade, and sometimes it's translated as emerald. In any case, it was a green stone that was very highly valued by the Nahuatl speakers and other people of Mesoamerica. With those explanations, I think we're ready to look at the poem. Here you can see the poem the way that Jose Gonzalez sent it to me, which is well written in the classical orthography. But I've already mentioned that the classical orthography didn't mark where the saltillos were. Let me just give you a couple of examples. The HU digraph is often used for a W sound. So the first word, as you look at it, you might think it was Nahuatl, but it's not Nahuatl, it's Netwatl. And a little later there's Chalchihuite. You might think that was Chalchihuite, but it's not. It doesn't have the glottal stop in that one, so it's Chalchihuite. Those are the kinds of things that it's easier for me if I can have a mark there to remind me. Stick in the glottal stop here. Here's a version of it that's written then with the glottal stops and the long vowels marked, and that's the one I'll read. Netwatl niklasotla in Cenzonte tlikuika. Netwatl niklasotla in Chalchihuite tlapalis. Ivanina viakme chochime. Sanoxenka nokniftsinintlakatl, Nahuatl niklasotla. All right, it's a beautiful poem, short and sweet. What does it mean? Here's a translation. I love the song of the mockingbird. That is the bird of 400 voices. I love the color of the jade and the fragrant flowers. But much more than that, my brother man is the one I love. It's easy to see why this poem was appreciated so much over the centuries. It's so simple. It's so beautiful. It so elegantly expresses how the author loves the world of nature that's around him, and even more than that, loves his fellow man. I'd like to finish by reading two versions in modern variants of Nahuatl. These are the two variants that I know well, unlike my knowledge of classical Nahuatl. And you'll notice several changes that are there. Some of them just the way the words sound. For instance, the word Nahuatl, which in the classical version is repeated several times and means I. In Tetelcingo they say Naha instead of Nahuatl. And in Orizaba they just say Ne. So that's going to sound different. In Tetelcingo, the long vowels changed sound so that the long O became an U and the long A became an O. The orthographies are the ones that are used in the two places, and one of the things that both of these orthographies do is where the classical orthography often had a C or a Z to mark the S sound, it's always written S in these two variants. And word order is changed a little bit. Sometimes I wasn't sure if the word order is needed. Nahuatl is rather freer than English or Spanish as far as word order goes. But I don't quite know what the effect of the word orders that Nezahualcoyotl chose were in the classical language, but in the other two languages I chose the orders that felt most natural to me. So here are the two versions. The first one will be in the Mösiehuali language, which is the Nahuatl of Tetelcingo, Morelos. Nahuatl icuicatili Centzontutl, Nahuatl itlapal Chalchihuite, Washuchime afeyoke. Noso okachime yak yaha notloka ikni, Nahuatl. Here now is the version in Masewaltlahtolli, the language of the Nahuatl speakers in the Sierra de Zongolica, south of the city of Orizaba, Veracruz. Neh niktlasohtla itlacuical Centzontli. Neh niktlasohtla itlapal Chalchihuite, iban inafiacayo xochime. Noso okachimiek yen notlacaicni, neh niktlasohtla. I love the song of the mockingbird. I love the color of the jade and the fragrant flowers, but much more than that, my brother man, he is the one I love. What would it be like if we really lived by that poem? If we took that kind of joy in nature that surrounds us, but especially if we took that kind of joy and expressed that kind of love for our fellow human beings, this world would be a better place if we did that.